Happy Wednesday to you. Hope you all are doing well out there in whitetail land. So I'm pretty sure the season for most of us is over. Of course, here in PA, it wrapped up here their last weekend. I guess a week ago, Saturday. So that was the last kind of hunt I had. Was looking for. I always kind of look at. Well, I guess let me put it this way: the end of the first season is always a little bit bittersweet because by the time that rolls around, I'm pretty well beat up and a little worse for wear. And I start really kind of looking forward to goose hunting a little bit, just because it's kind of a relaxing hunt. You still have to get up early, but you're in, typically, one of the spots that I hunt with a couple buddies. It's like we'll be in a blind together. We kind of sit and talk, do a little calling. Geese come by, they land. You're like they cup up and kind of roll in on you, and you take a crack at them. You drop a few, and it's usually a morning hunt. And I get to kind of go home and take care of whatever things I need to take care of around the house. So I can it's a nice kind of hunt life balance, if you will, because during the course of archery season, there is not much hunt life balance. It is all hunt balance for the most part. So the wife is usually pretty excited whenever the first season ends and goose season rolls around, because she knows I'll be home a little bit more often. So I did a little goose hunt this past weekend. Got nada, missed, and then I had to get out of there. Had some things to take care of in the afternoon, so I really only got the hunt for a couple hours in the morning, but nonetheless, it was good. Of course, we have the Christmas holiday that's coming up, which everyone, I'm sure, is gearing up for. I hope everyone has gotten out and gotten got their Christmas lists filled and finished all their holiday shopping, because I'm typically the guy that is in the store the night before, like 2 days before, battling the crowds, and it's horrendous. So I actually am ahead of the game and got everything done except for one thing that I need to order for the wife, and then I will be all wrapped up. And hopefully there'll be some hunting gifts flying around in my stocking and so forth, which wouldn't be a terrible thing. One quick announcement or a bit of housekeeping here to just kind of give you guys a heads up on before we get started with today's show. I know I kind of mentioned it a couple months ago or 2 months ago that I'm going to have a larger announcement that's coming. I can't kind of let the cat out of the bag yet, but just want to let you guys know that I do have something in the works that I think is going to be really cool. I'm hoping that a lot of you out there listening will take part in. I'm thinking that it's going to launch soon after the first of the year is when it'll get started. And I'm really excited to share it with you guys. I'm sorry I can't give any more details than that right now. You don't want to let the cat out of the bag because, as things kind of happen, you hit hiccups along the way, and I don't want to say when it's going to be here and then have to kind of pull back from that based on any hiccups that we have kind of along the way. So just kind of keep your ears peeled. I'll be making an announcement shortly after the first of the year here on the podcast, and of course, if you're on the email list, you'll get that as well on the newsletter that comes out every month. So keep your ears peeled for that. But today we have a killer show. So today is one that I've been looking forward to for a while. We have Dawn Higgins on from Real World Outdoor Products. Dawn, of course, is of the 400 inches of bone fame from last year. I mean, he's been a whale of a hunter for a lot of years. He's got 40 plus years in the industry, in the outdoors, hunting and also working in the outdoors as a writer, being on, in film. But Dawn, aside from all those things, Dawn is just a quality person. It's always kind of good when you speak with him, whether it's a deer hunting strategy or just, life in general. I think you'll kind of find in this podcast, he brings a sense of levity to the conversation, which is oftentimes lost. And it's kind of refreshing. I won't say it's kind of refreshing. I'll say that it is refreshing to have a conversation with someone who is as devout in their convictions and their beliefs, and is fully and has I guess kind of expresses those in full candor. And it's just nice to have someone like Don in the outdoor industry. It's nice to have someone like him that you can talk to and get his perspective, because he has a really, really keen sense of how to just kind of cut through the BS and get to the meat of what you're trying to talk about. And for that, I'm appreciative of him spending some time with us. And then aside from that, of course, his whitetail knowledge that he shared with us during the course of the hour and a half or so that John and I had a chance to talk with him. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about a couple of the partners that help make this podcast possible before we jump to John. So first and foremost, we are brought to you by Wicked Tree Gear, the longest lasting, fastest cutting, toughest tree trimming equipment you have ever used. Simply put, the toughest saws on earth. How tough are they? Tough enough to come with a lifetime warranty. And right now, when you visit wickedtreegear.com, use the promo code TRUTH at checkout and get a 20% discount on your Wicked purchase. And if you didn't know, those hand saws fit very nicely inside of a stocking. So just heads up on that. We're also brought to you by Exodus Outdoor Gear. The Exodus Trek is a byproduct of all the consumer voices who have been excited about what Exodus trail cameras have to offer, but just can't fit a $200 camera in their budget, and that's all right. A budget-friendly camera backed by the industry's leading warranty is now here. The Trek is $145, has the same proprietary shell design as the Lift Series camera, 5-year warranty, same customer service, photo, video, time-lapse, and hybrid modes, all with a simple single-line backlit LED display. You also get just about 20,000 images on a set of lithium batteries. I saw someone asking the other day about how many images, you can anticipate getting in a trail camera, on one set of batteries. The Lift will give you about 20K, and the Trek will give you about 20K, and the Lift will give you about 25,000. So those are some pretty good numbers. If you'd like to learn more about Exodus trail cameras, check them out at ExodusOutdoorGear.com. If you dig what you are seeing, use TRUTH promo code at checkout and save yourself $20. Also, this time of year, you're going to be taking some food back and forth to grandma's house. You're going to be going to Christmas parties. You're going to go to New Year's Eve or New Year's parties. And then, you might just even be driving to ATA, making a road trip with your buddies. And when you're doing all those things, you probably need a cooler to keep your drinks cold, to keep your food cold as you're traveling. So if you do, or if you are going to travel, even if you're not, you should check out Glacier Coolers, simply the world's finest, whether you're hunting, fishing, camping, or if you're going to ATA or grandma's house, you'll enjoy smarter design, stronger construction, and superior installation of Glacier Coolers. Visit them at glaciercoolers.com. Promo code TRUTH. Save yourself 20%. Now, without further ado, let's get Don Higgins on the line. All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of the Truth from the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast. And today we are joined by a gentleman that probably doesn't need a whole lot of introduction to most of you all out there listening. We are joined by none other than Don Higgins of course, of his 400-inch fame of last year. He's a veteran of putting down many mature deer. He does a ton of work in the outdoor industry with his habitat consulting business, his seed business. He's a man of many talents. So, Don, pleasure to have you on. Thanks for joining.
Well, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk deer hunting. I'm just appreciate you guys having me on.
Yeah, you bet. It's like I couldn't think of a much better guy to talk some deer hunting with you. So, this question here is just really to get the party started, because I know a lot of folks know who you are. You've been, a guy that's been, well known, of course, in the outdoor industry and as a hunter in general, for a long time. But for anyone out there who may have been living under a rock for the past 40 years, if you wouldn't mind, just give us a little bit of background about yourself, where you're from, and what you're doing in the whitetail world professionally.
Okay. Well, I live in Central Illinois. Grew up in a small town here in Central Illinois, and that's just crazy about the outdoors. From the time I could, basically the time I was old enough to walk, I was just exploring the outdoors. Then when I was 16 years old, I shot my first whitetail, and on that day, I basically forgot about everything else. And I have not turkey hunted a day in my life. I've not been fishing in over 25 years. I can't even remember the last time I small game hunted or anything like that. For me, it's all about big whitetails.
Right.
To make a living, I've got a lot of iron in the fire, but I'm one of the co-owners of Real World Wildlife Products, a food plot seed and deer nutrition company. I have a consulting business that has just exploded. Where I meet with landowners from around the Midwest primarily and design plans specific to their properties. Do some seminars. Do 6 or 8 or 10 of those a year. I've authored a couple of books, which I sell on my website. Basically anything to keep them getting a real job and being able to work with deer hunters.
I like the sounds of that. That's for sure. I don't know that I would I wouldn't complain about that life very much if I do say so myself. The I know you've been doing a lot of work with, of course, in the recent past with your, some of the I guess supplemental feed, mineral, et cetera, that side of your business. And I know you've had a deer herd like in the past, or I think recently, if I'm not mistaken, you just recently got rid of that deer herd, or the last few of them. How much did you, how much, developing those products and stuff and having that herd around you really kind of, teach you anything, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Well, it was a unique experience. I acquired a small herd of captive deer, and way back, I had them over 20 years. I haven't had them for over a year now. I dispersed that herd basically to give me more time in the woods more than anything else. But I got them to basically learn more about whitetails. I just wanted to be the best hunter I could possibly be, and I thought, well, having a few deer around, I'll learn about them, learn their vocalizations and things like that. But in the end, what I learned just far exceeded what I ever expected to learn. And on the nutrition end of things, I started doing experiments with basically on nutrition and genetics. For 11 straight years, I artificially bred to some of the biggest bucks in the world to learn about antler genetics. And at the same time, I was doing research on nutrition. And, just the things that I learned played a big role in some of the products we developed at Real World Wildlife Products. Now, that wasn't the only thing. We've also got 2 professional livestock nutritionists on staff, as well as one of the leading whitetail veterinarians in the world, Dr. Shipley at the University of Illinois, that we consulted with as we put these products together. But, just learning about the feeding habits of deer it was really eye-opening. For example, one quick note I'll throw out there was I figured out right out of the gate that the amount of food that a deer takes in changes greatly throughout the fall months, especially. In September and early October, the deer are really putting away, a lot of calories, building fat for the winter. But then when winter rolls around, their caloric intake is really low. For example, I had a pen one year that these had a handful of bucks in there, and during the early fall, those bucks were eating 2 complete 5-gallon buckets of feed every day. And in the winter, those very same deer in the winter were consuming less than 1 bucket, probably about 2/3 to 3/4 of 1 bucket. So their feed intake was more than cut in half from, say, late September till early December. And I didn't realize how much they cut back. And, there's a lot of things that are promoted in the deer hunting world. Outdoor writers like myself are guilty of promoting some ideas that really aren't true. And one of those is the idea that after the rut, these bucks go on a feeding binge to replace lost calories. Well, that just simply does not happen. They don't replace that. Their appetite doesn't really pick back up until the following spring. They, Mother Nature almost puts them into, I wouldn't really call it hibernation, but their metabolism slows down where they don't require as many calories. When the food is the most scarce in the winter, they just don't require as much. And I'm sure that's Mother Nature's way of protecting them. Right. But, just on the nutrition end of things, I could probably talk the rest of the night on some of the things I've learned about nutrition just through that captive herd of deer.
Right. And I know initially we were going to talk first, about, hunting the late rut and then wanted to get into late season. But since you brought up the feeding aspect of things, I kind of want to jump right into it because I had a few initial questions just based off of that. Because, first when you say, that they're, they really slow down their feeding whenever it hits, if I'm remembering correctly, what you said is around October-ish. And I'm just kind of thinking, it's interesting that happens about the same time that hunter pressure happens, the quote unquote October lull hits, whether some people believe it, some people don't believe it. It's a lull. There's, environmental factors at play, and I think, people not even recognizing that, that their feeding pattern changes at that time as well, not just changing bed to food pattern that they typically are on during the summer, but also their feeding need changes at that time as well. How much do you think that, I mean, I guess that contributes their kind of, how am I trying to say this? Their invisibility during that period of the year, or that perceived invisibility during that time of year.
Yeah, well, October is the month where the big change happens. In early October, they're still feeding. They're putting away a lot of calories. But by the end of October, they're getting interested in the rut, and feeding takes a back seat to the rut. So the month of October is when that switch happens, but it continues. Their feed intake continues to decline in through the month of November and into early December.
Gotcha. Okay.
And not only that, the nutrients they require changes as well. Like early in the summer when they're growing their racks, they're looking for high protein food sources. That's when you see them out in the alfalfa fields and the soybean fields. Those are high protein food sources that they're feeding on then. But then as you get into the fall and those antlers have hardened and they're putting on the fat for the winter, they're looking for food sources that are higher in carbohydrates and fat. That's when they're really hitting the acorns, and they'll get into the corn and some of the other crops like that. But the nutrients within their food sources really changes in the fall as well.
Right. When do you see, when does the switch, I guess, flip back on for them to kind of really start, trying to, is there a specific, I guess when in watching your herd, was there a specific time period where you could almost set your watch to it, where it was after the rut, they kind of go through the rut, they, deplete their body, and then all of a sudden, boom, this week kind of signifies the time when they're going to really be back on food and requiring to take in more calories?
No, throughout the winter, their food intake is really geared towards the weather. The colder the weather, the more they're going to feed and take in. They really don't get back onto that steady increasing appetite until spring. So it's really sporadic throughout the late fall and winter, and it's geared around weather patterns. The colder it gets, then the more they're going to eat.
Interesting. So, I mean, because you always hear, and I mean, I'm guilty of this too, is right after the rut happens, it's I'm unfortunately one of those poor individuals who's still holding two buck tags, or a buck tag in two different states. So I'm looking toward late season here, or second season here in Pennsylvania to try to get something done. And you always hear people talk about, after the rut, you hit a certain part of the year and in late season where you of course want to focus on food, but people will talk about the bed to food pattern starting to come back a little bit. And I don't know, as I'm sitting here thinking about what you're saying, I'm thinking it's probably not so much the bed to food pattern that comes back, that it's more the food to weather pattern that you probably want to pay attention to. Is that a fair kind of way to look at it?
Yeah, exactly. They are on a feeding pattern now, but it's not the pattern that people think about where it's, every day this buck is headed to this food source. There's days, I remember when those captive deer, there was days where they hardly ate anything. I mean, those deer that I talked about that were eating 2 5-gallon buckets early in the fall, there would be days where those deer didn't eat a quarter of one bucket. But then there would be other days, when they would eat a full bucket or so. And it was all seemed to be geared around the weather, and especially the cold weather temperatures. Right. The colder the temperatures, the more calories they got to take in to stay warm.
Right.
So we get these misconceptions, and a lot of it's passed on by outdoor riders that these deer are going to hit these food sources on a regular basis, day after day. And the fact is that some days they're going to hit them a whole lot harder than others. Mm-hmm. There'll be afternoons where those deer will be out there 2 hours before dark, feeding heavily, and there'll be other afternoons where you hardly see a deer.
Right. So, I mean, again, well, let me take a step back for a second and think about, since we're kind of talking about late season here a little bit, and I guess look at it more high level and from a broader, I guess, spectrum. So when you start to think about late season, and say you're me, for example, and you've got a couple buck tags that you're trying to fill, what are you focusing on, or when you're trying to track down a mature buck that you've had your eye on, say you've had some encounters during the course of the fall, and maybe you had some summer pictures when you were doing some scouting or some glassing or whatever, are there any consistencies that you've noticed over the years in how mature bucks behave, or how their movement might shift during this time of year, and anything that's unique or out of the ordinary?
Well, I think the one thing I've noticed is that they will gravitate towards the prime food source in their area. I know on my property, I've always got standing soybeans and other crops growing and left stand for them all winter. And I'll have people think that you have new bucks show up during the rut looking for does. I don't see that whatsoever. What I see is new bucks showing up in the late season. When the food gets scarce, that's when those new ones show up.
Right.
So I think they gravitate towards the prime food source within their range. And then you've got to find that, and then you've got to hunt the weather patterns.
Right. Do you knowing that they're going to hit those kind of prime, or what we'll call their attractant food sources, or the larger food sources, if you will? Is it worthwhile, I guess is what I'm asking, to use kill plots in those instances, or do you feel like those are something that are probably more geared toward being used in the early part of the fall, or the during the rut time period?
Well, they certainly have their place. I think a lot of it has to do with pressure, hunting pressure. If you're hunting an area where there's a lot of pressure, you're probably not going to get too many bucks to step out into a 5-acre field before dark. I mean, it's going to take even more extreme weather. Now, if it gets down to where there's several days in a row where the temperatures are below zero, well, then, yeah, the most nocturnal buck in the woods, he's got to take in calories to stay alive. He's going to be out there. Whereas back on a kill plot, it's a little more secluded. Might not take such extreme conditions to get him on his feet there during daylight hours.
Right. So, I mean, that makes sense. It's like, if someone was trying to kill you, I'd be hard pressed unless you had to step out into the open. It feels like, the kill plot seems like, depending on what type of pressure you're experiencing on your property, could be a viable option. It seems like the more pressure you have, the better opportunity it might be to use one of those in high pressure states or high pressure properties.
Yeah, exactly.
But speaking of cover, and just in safety, I'm just curious if during the late season, if you've ever seen a specific type of cover in all the years you've spent in the woods that has been used more often than others. So it's like, when you hit late season, are you seeing those mature bucks kind of hold up in let's just say like a pine thicket or something like that, or are you seeing them holing up more in like something that's 4 or 5 foot tall and just super brushy? What type of habitat are you seeing them most often take cover during that time of the year?
Well, there's one thing that trumps the type of cover, and mature buck typically will stick cover, but the one thing that trumps that is human intrusion, the lack of human intrusion. A mature buck, he would rather bed in a wide open woods with no human intrusion than he would a thicket that's got hunters stomping through it. And it doesn't have to be intense pressure. I mean, he wants a place where he's never going to be disturbed during daylight hours. Mm-hmm. So, it's that freedom of human intrusion that makes for good bedding cover more than how thick it is or what kind of cover it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Like, I mean, people, just what you said, people always kind of associate, cover with how thick it is, and if people may have more and better encounters if they kind of change their mindset and think about cover in the terms of their own intrusion, right? It's like, to your point, I was just hunting this buck, or I was hunting a small piece of public property the other day, and this buck was bedded out in the middle of that public swamp without any cover, and I just kind of walked up on him. I didn't notice him till it was too late to really do anything about it. It was, super dry out, super crunchy. And he saw me, he bounded away a few, probably 20, 30 yards and stopped because I don't think he was sure what he had seen. And so he just kind of stopped and looked at me for a couple minutes. Then he bounded off on his, on his merry way. And as I'm walking to my stand, I'm thinking to myself, I was like, man, I cannot believe that. It's like, I would have never thought I would have found a bedded buck laying right where I found him. You know what I mean? It's like, cause there was all this thick cover that's kind of on the fringe of this along this stream, but that stream is also adjacent to a shooting club. So there's always people over there shooting, walking around and stuff like that. So that was probably just a place that he just never gets bothered until I walk through, of course.
Yep.
But
it's that freedom of human intrusion that every mature buck wants.
Yeah, that's for sure. I think as I get older too, I want less human intrusion, right? It's like
yeah, I'm with you.
So I'm curious, man, how, during the late season, I know during, the summer, we all, get giddy about our velvet buck pictures and, and during the, when fall hits, we get excited about the bucks that are sticking around that, stuck around or have returned after the shift happened there in the early fall. So I'm just curious on how you're using your cameras during the, the later part of the season here.
Well, I've actually cameras. A lot of times the bucks, from what I've noticed, about 50% of the bucks will shift from a summer range to a different fall range. About half of them will stay where they summer, and the other half will move. And unfortunately for me, the best bucks I was watching last summer moved, and but past trail camera history shows me that the best buck that I was watching last year, he moves back to his summer range early, like in January. So I'm hoping he comes back before the season's over. So I'm really I'm focusing my cameras around prime food sources, and I'm checking them more as the season winds down. I'm checking them a little more frequently than I have earlier, just so that I can be on top of things as they happen. If a new buck starts hitting a food source, I want to know about it. Now, 2 weeks from now, gives me the best chance to kill him. So I'm checking those cameras around those prime food sources about once a week, just to kind of stay on top of things.
Right. And how is that different for you from earlier in the year? Are you checking them less frequently early in the year?
Yeah, early in the year, I'm checking them about once a month or sometimes I'll even go 6 or 8 weeks. As the season winds down, that's when I start checking them more frequently. Then when the season's over, I pretty much leave the cameras out and don't bother them at all until spring when bucks have pretty much shed their antlers. So, as the season winds down, I want to be on top of things so I still have a chance to capitalize on anything I see.
Right. I'm curious. I wanted to ask you this question. There's two things that I really kind of wanted to ask you. One's about late rut, and one was, really specifically during this late season. Because we always hear, especially when you get into rut, it's you can find as much or have as much information on a deer as you possibly can. And rut kind of hits, and I know you've killed plenty of big bucks in October, and it seems like the guys who can get on a deer and pattern a deer, a lot of times will really try to get the job done in October before they really start expanding their territory or their cruising range, right? So I'm just curious to you, and rut seems to be about timing. It's like you put your time in the stand, and a deer might be in the area, and you get in the right spot, and timing is kind of plays a really important role in that. And so I'm just curious to see, your perspective. If timing seems to be everything during the rut to for some folks, is it just as important in late season, or is it more about that kind of that, I guess, that earlier season mindset of really starting to try to pattern that deer and understanding what his needs and how those might change day to day, especially when you were just talking about the weather patterns really helping to drive their feeding patterns?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, probably the best time to kill a specific mature buck is during the late season. That probably comes as a shock for a lot of people to hear me say that, but in the early season, a buck has so many options as far as feeding and hiding. covers everywhere, food's everywhere. And then during the rut, trying to pattern an individual buck, well, he's covering so many miles, literally miles, in search of does and chasing does. At least a lot of bucks are, that for you to cross paths with him takes a good bit of luck. But during the late season, undisturbed cover is scarce. Prime food sources are scarce. And if you can have both of those ingredients, and then the final ingredient is bad weather. If you know where a buck can bed safely, and you know where he can feed on a prime food source close to it, and then you get a spell of really bad weather that lasts several days, that is the best time and the best situation to kill a specific big buck on purpose.
Nice. And that's usually those bad weather days too, or those days where a lot of folks don't want to go out. You know what I mean? They want to stay in the nice, comfy, warm house instead of sitting in a tree somewhere,
Yeah, and I'm talking brutal weather. I mean, I'm talking it's so cold out there that you got, ice freezing to your face. the colder, the better. I mean, if it's 0, then you're talking.
Right.
Because that buck is going to be on his feet, and he is going to be feeding.
Yeah, that was actually the next question I wanted to ask you. It's weather this time of year is fickle, to say the least. And you just said, the colder the better, but is there anything that you like in addition to the cold? Like, do you like a little bit of precip? Do you like a certain type of, a certain speed of wind that you found has been kind of, most beneficial during this time of year?
Well, having some snow cover on is definitely beneficial. The ideal conditions would be, say 3 to 6 inches of snow on the ground and temperatures that are 0 or below at night, and maybe in the teens as a high in the day. Brutal cold, where your cars and trucks aren't starting, and everything's froze up. That's right. The kind of conditions that every mature buck, no matter how nocturnal he was during the rut, he's going to be on his feet before dark.
Not only that, but then you got a self-made deep freezer in the back of your truck when you toss him in there too, right? Don't have to worry about.
Yeah, there you go.
It's no need to rush to get the hide off. That's for sure.
He's not going to spoil.
No, that's an understatement there. So I'm curious. We're talking about them getting on their feet. Looking for food. Weather as nasty as we can possibly get is really what we're looking for. I'm just curious because I know you do, as you mentioned, with your outdoor company and so forth, the seed and the mineral and all the stuff you've been doing with that. I just want to get your perspective and all the consulting you do as well. If you could only plant one food plot, for late season, what would it be? If you could only have one crop in that you were like, this is going to be the spot where I'm going to kill a magnum, what would that food be?
Oh, this is the easiest question I've ever had. Soybeans, hands down, no doubt about it. There's not even a close second. Soybeans.
Really? Yeah. I was contemplating putting some soybeans on my dad's property next year. I didn't put any on this year. I've never planted soybeans. Is there any kind of trick to it? Because I usually go with things that I know I can grow pretty easily. I did plant one type of soybean. I guess it was 3 years ago. I had a hard time getting it in the ground just because I was waiting for the temperature to get to the right kind of envelope or the right range. And then we had a super wet spring, so I was getting it in kind of late. Is there any, I guess, tricks to the trade for planting soybeans for success?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, forget forage soybeans. We're talking about late season, and we're talking about the deer hitting the grain, not the leaves. Forget forage soybeans. They're not going to do you any good. Most forage soybeans are a longer growing season bean that I planted them on my farm, 6-7 years, just because I followed the hype that I'd heard. And it's a waste of plot space for a guy in the northern region of the country. They probably got their place in southern states. I'm not going to knock them down there. But when it comes to guys, say, from Kentucky north, you need to be planting real world soybeans, I believe. But,
right.
They're higher in oil or fat. The pods are shatter resistant, but that is the ticket. Soybeans are very easy to grow. They're one of the easiest plots you'll ever grow. You can throw soybeans out on the bare dirt. You don't even have to cover them. If you get a rain on them, they're going to sprout and grow. But the key really is browse pressure on a small plot. The deer will just wipe them out. So you need a fairly good sized plot, or you need to fence that plot or do something to keep the deer out of it. But once they're established, then you got to control the weeds. If a lot of soybeans are Roundup ready, which means you can spray Roundup right over the top of them. It won't hurt the soybeans whatsoever, but it'll kill the weeds. It makes it very easy to control the weeds in your plot. But there's a lot of different methods for planting them. You can use a planter or a drill, or you can just broadcast them.
Yeah, that was what I was curious about, because I don't have any big equipment. I basically have an ATV with a little disc on it is what I usually use on this piece. I do have one other farm that's in the family that I do help out with some that we have a small tractor and a disc and stuff like that, but we don't have a drill or anything like that. So I'd probably just be mainly broadcasting. I mean, do you need to increase your broadcast rate, your seed rate to whenever you're doing it that way?
Yeah, it won't hurt to a little, but I mean, 50 pounds of soybeans per acre is a good rate. Maybe if you're broadcasting it up that to 60, and the reason for it is you're probably going to get some seed too deep and some too shallow. Although if it rains, it's almost impossible to have them too shallow if they get a good rain on them and the moisture's there.
Right. And so, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, a soybean plant has a unique ability to utilize the space it's given. So if they're planted a little bit heavy, the beans each plant won't get quite as tall or quite as bushy. But if they're planted a little bit light, they'll get taller and bush out more. So they've kind of got a unique ability to fill in the space that they're given.
Right. Now, you were mentioning just the browse pressure, and that was one of the things I'm was thinking about, just because I don't have a ton of space on this particular piece of land. So what would you say is your minimum, as far as size of plot for soybeans?
Well, that's pretty tough to say, because it's based on deer density and other food sources available. Where I'm at, I'm in an area with heavy agriculture, where I've got soybean fields that are hundreds of acres all around me. To take some pressure off my plots, I'm able to plant.
All right, folks, sorry about that. We had a little technical difficulty here, but we have Don back on. So, John, I've been jabbering here, man. I want to give you a chance here to ask some questions. I think you have a question you want to chime in with.
Yes. What's happening, Don? How are you, bud?
Good, Don. How about you?
Good. Hey, so my question for you, one of many, is late season. This is something that I've struggled with for years and years, and I don't know everything there is to know, so I'm going to somebody who I know that knows more than me, and I'll pick your brain. You get those situations in late season.
You, but I'll give it a shot.
Well, you get in those situations in late season, and it's 5-10 degrees outside, and I'm sitting on beans that night. And my buddy, he goes to his turnips, and he goes to his radishes and oats plot. And I'm like, I haven't seen a deer all night. And he's texting me, and he's like, I'm absolutely covered up in deer tonight. So the next day, nothing has changed whatsoever. The wind's still the same. The barometric pressure's the same. We're very similar to a moon phase. Temperatures, everything's the same. So I say, screw it. I'm going to go to turnips and oats tonight and see what happens. And then I text my buddy, and he says, yeah, I moved over to beans, and I am absolutely covered up today, and I haven't seen a deer one. What advice or what tips would you give for picking the right food source in those late season conditions?
Well, it sounds like a whole lot more deer and a whole lot less pressure than the other one. Is that the case, or?
No, I mean, is there kind of a general, and I get it. There's always going to be conditions that warrant. Maybe there was a late shotgun season that came through an area or something like that. But just overall, if you have if you're going out to a certain food source that has equal pressure on two different food sources, is there one that you will pick over the other for different conditions in the late season? And maybe it is a slight temperature change or more sun or something like that.
If the temperatures are above normal for that time of year, I will hit greens. If they're below normal for that time of year, I'll hit grains. Grains and greens. A well-managed property will have both.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's pretty much my general rule. If it's warmer than normal, I hit the greens. Colder than normal, I hit the grains.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So
that answers that. Pretty simple rule of thumb answer right there.
There you go. So John, when you got to put on sunscreen, you're going to go to the greens.
I'll go to the greens. Yep.
Exactly.
And I'm not going to guarantee that's going to work 100% of the time. But that's the general rule that I follow.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it gives a starting point, and like I said, that's one of the things that I've struggled with in the past is, my heart tells me, when the sun's out and it's a little warmer, go to greens. When it's really, really cold, go to beans or corn. But then I've had it kind of backfire and flip flop on me, before, and then it leaves you questioning your judgment, and you're like, well, maybe I don't have this figured out.
Man, just get a little bit closer each year, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. So, I know that we're, focusing on some food plot stuff here, and what we should be sitting over, during, what type of weather and so forth. But, can setting up on an area where there's a lot of browse, be effective, or as effective as hunting over a traditional plot, and if so, what type of browse would you really be kind of looking for? Say you're on a piece of property that doesn't have a food plot or doesn't have ag, and you still want to hunt late season, and maybe there's a buck close by there. What type of natural browse would you be looking for to set up on?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. It's you want that second growth. Get away from the mature timber. Get out on the edges and the open meadows where shrubs and briars. Blackberry briars are great browse for deer, believe it or not. But those smaller saplings and bushes that have the smaller, more tender branches that the deer can eat on. I mean, there's like literally hundreds of different plants that a deer will browse on. Some, of course, preferred more than others, but there's so many that they like. As much as they
right, so
pinch points and things like that.
Right, so you're saying it's a combination of what the browse that's available and what the terrain features are doing in terms of how they're funneling deer. It's kind of going back to that type of approach, which is very reminiscent of earlier in the year to a degree, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Before we continue our conversation, let's talk about Wicked Tree Gear saws. Hardcore deer hunters need hardcore tools. Do yourself a favor and check out Wicked Tree Gear, the toughest hand saws and pull saws on earth. You buy it once, you buy it for life, backed by a lifetime guarantee. Right now, if you use the promo code TRUTH, you'll save 20% on your next purchase with free ground shipping. So head over to wickedtreegear.com and get a saw that's tough enough to work as hard as you hunt. So I want to shift gears a little bit here. We've been covering some late season stuff, and I want to get into some of the late rut stuff because, and we'll get to that in a second because you really kind of piqued my interest with some stuff that I heard you talk about and write about at one point. But, I know we've talked, or mentioned, you've been in the outdoor industry a long time in a lot of different capacities. So I'm just curious whenever I meet folks and get a chance to talk to folks who have been doing it a long time, what their opinion is or their perspective is on how the hunting industry and hunting in general has changed over the years for the good or or detriment. So I'm just curious your opinion. Like, well, how have you seen things change, and what was good and what is bad, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's an interesting question.
It's a loaded one, right?
Yeah. It's definitely changed. There's plenty of things that I like, plenty of changes I like, and there's some I don't. I guess the technology that's come along has been game changing. I remember the day when something like a trail camera wouldn't even have been imaginable, let alone a possibility. Personally, I like trail cameras. I mean, I have probably close to 50 of them, and they've definitely helped me kill some bucks that I probably would not have killed without them. What I like about them is they expand my season. Instead of waiting for October 1st to be able to sit in a tree, I'm hitting the woods July 1st, putting out cameras. And I really like that because basically my only time that I'm not in the woods is early or late spring when it finally greens up. From then until July, about the 1st of July, is about the only time I'm not spending much time in the woods all year. And then, I'm putting them trail cameras out, and it really expands my season, makes it more enjoyable. I've been at it long enough that I remember when there was no outdoor TV, and that came along, and it seemed to run through a cycle. When it was really popular, there was, multiple networks with nothing but hunting shows, and it seemed like every Tom, Dick, and Harry that ever shot a 2-year-old buck had a TV show. You could walk into a trade show, and they were all walking around wanting to hand out their media kits, looking for sponsorships, and at the same time, the companies in the outdoor industry were just handing them free product right and left, anybody that come along, and that's kind of changed. I used to watch a lot of outdoor TV, and it's been years since I've watched any of it. So I think there's a lot of other people that have kind of followed that same pattern. Good, bad, or otherwise, I don't know. I don't know. It's there's some of the technology that bothers me some, especially things like the cell cams. And some of these odor killing machines, for lack of a better word. Where's the challenge? Are we trying to take all the challenge out of deer hunting?
Mm-hmm.
Our weapons, they just become more efficient. We as hunters become more proficient. Oh, where's it end? And yet, with all these things out there, there's still a lot of hunters that have a hard time filling their tags. So, I don't know. There was good hunters before we had all this technology, and there's good hunters today, and there was bad hunters back then. There's bad hunters today. So, I got mixed feelings on it. It is what it is. I can't complain too much when I'm a guy that's out there running 50 trail cameras. How can I say too much about it, So it basically, it's how you use it. I would like to see, I guess if there's one big complaint that I have with the hunting industry today is it's a lack of good moral role models, guys that are preaching ethics. It's not just about the kill. It's not just about how many big bucks a guy can hang up, but how you go about it and what you get back to the sport. I see so many takers that are, they're trying to reap the rewards of fame through hunting, and yet they're never willing to give anything back.
Mm-hmm.
I just, I kind of cherish the whitetail as a species, but also the individuals. Every deer that I shoot, I want it to get close so I can make a good, humane kill. I don't want to be lobbing arrows at 80 yards and think you cannot really accomplish something. To me, it's a close-range sport, and the closer you get, the better. But that doesn't really give me the right to force my views onto another bow hunter. But I'd just like to see, more role models that are pushing ethics and conservation instead of me.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you there, and that was why I wanted to ask you the question, because it's, I've watched and listened to you from afar, and if I know one thing at all from listening to you is your candor is well known, and you speak honestly. And that's why I kind of wanted to ask you the question, because I know I get an honest answer. So I have a follow up to that, because I think you started touching on it a little bit, and that is, do you think you mentioned the ethics aspect of it, and would like to see more hunters give back and be more concerned with the conservation angle of it, as opposed to getting hunting famous, if you will. How do you think hunters overall are faring in being, I guess, responsible for the type of image that we're portraying to the masses?
Well, we are totally responsible for it. The sad thing is that we've lacked role models in recent years for these younger hunters, and the whack 'em, stack 'em, if it's brown, it's down gang is kind of grabbed a hold of the youth, and that's the approach a lot of them take, and they just lack true conservationists as role models.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, I'm not trying to duck any question.
No.
If I didn't answer it, go ahead and re-ask it. I'll be glad to answer it.
No, you answered it just fine. I mean, that was kind of what I was, was getting at. It was just, I think there's been a lot of discussion. John and I have had this conversation. I know there's other, guys with, much more well-known podcasts than I have, that talk about these things as well. And I think one of the biggest challenges we have is how we portray ourselves to not just other hunters, but to the non-hunting public, because we are our best keeper. You know what I mean? We are our brother's keeper, to a degree, where it's, we're the ones who are going to be responsible for how we're viewed, ultimately, how our group is viewed, ultimately, how our sport is viewed. And then also, what type of privileges we have or don't have going forward. We're going to have a lot to do with that. And it's going to be how we approach, to your point, if we have the right people that are, paving the way through, hunting ethically and morally and making good choices and hard choices when hard choices are needed to be made when they're the right ones, which is exactly what you were saying, which is what I was kind of getting at. I know John has a follow-up question. So John, did you have something you want to chime in with?
Well, just what we were saying as far as, we can be our own worst enemy sometime. I mean, I've always said, I'll never apologize for being a hunter to the non-hunters, but at the same time, I do make efforts to not give them any ammunition either. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I think that's comes with being a good steward of the sport. And I think that's something we can all do. But my comment was, thinking about us as hunters and like Don was saying, wanting to get close to the animals and having respect for the animals. There was definitely a period where, as a hunter, that if I did not kill a buck, it really bothered me. It bothered me a whole lot. And I let it get to me almost to the point where it was becoming too much. Like I was putting too much pressure on myself, and it wasn't it wasn't fun. Fortunately, I matured more and I grew up, and that kind of went away. And most recently, I was down in South Texas, Don. I've never hunted Texas before, and I went way, way, way down there on a no-fence ranch. I guess a no-fence farm, but I mean down there they call them ranches. But humongous property. The highest fence that I saw was like 3.5, 4 foot tall, and I'm hunting these gas line right-of-ways that have been cut into this brush. And for anybody listening, if you've been to Texas, then you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, it's like a cedar tree crossbred with multiflora rose crossbred with honeysuckle. I mean, just impenetrable type brush. And so they've got all these right-of-ways cut in. Got on the ground, no blind, no decoys, nothing like that. I just crouched down on the ground with my bow and a set of rattling horns and rattled this buck into 27 yards. But he was right behind one of these bushes. And I, it's one of those deals with a 30-30 brush gun, probably wouldn't have been a problem. With a bow and arrow, it's not something a shot I was willing to take. And even 5 minutes after, 20 minutes after, 3 days afterwards, I still have the same feeling of, man, that was an absolute blast. I can't wait to go back there and do that again. And the revelation was, 10 years ago, I probably would have been, well, that was the worst hunt of my life because I didn't get to release an arrow. That's the best hunt I've ever had in my life. And I didn't shoot anything. You know what I mean? So,
Yep.
it's one of those things where, I even told my wife, I said, does this mean I'm an adult now? Like, am I starting to grow up? Am I starting to turn a leaf over to, am I becoming one of those guys? And it's one of those guys that I have aspired to be. And I wanted it to be honest and genuine and authentic,
Well, the biggest issue I see, I've already said it, but it goes back to role models. Whenever I was younger, I looked up to guys like Gene and Barry Wenzel, Roger Rothar, and those guys, they were big buck killers, but they also preached ethics. A gentleman named Alan Foster had a big impact on me because he was a local guy that I actually worked with. But he wrote for North American Whitetail for back in the late '80s and '90s. But he was always preaching ethics, and I was really blessed that my role models were very ethical hunters. And today, I look around and who these kids have to look up to. It's all about, and I'm probably guilty to some degree myself, but people think that I'm just, it's all big bucks and that's all I care about. But the fact is, I think I've taken 7 different hunters hunting on my property this year, and 4 of them have killed bucks on my property. I have not killed a buck myself. So there's a lot that people don't realize about me. And one of the things is that I try to give back to the sport instead of just being a taker. And not just to individual hunters, but to the sport overall. I try to be a role model for these younger kids, especially in my latest book that I wrote. It came out in 2012, so it's been a few years now. But one of the driving forces behind that book was I wanted that book to be something that a young kid that's getting into bow hunting could read. And, there's some morals and some ethics there. It's not just about killing big bucks, which I love to do as much as anybody. The hunt for big bucks is what drives me. It's what gets me out of bed every day. But how I do it's important too. It's not just the end result. Justifies the means. Mm-hmm. It's I want to do it not just legally, but ethically as well, and do it as if the whole world were sitting there watching over my shoulder and be proud of how I did it. Mm-hmm. I know back in 2004, I shot my biggest buck ever, scored 214 inches, and a lot of people don't realize it, but I passed up 3 opportunities to shoot that buck before the day I shot him from 3 different tree stands. On 3 different days, just because it wasn't an ethical shot. One time I had the buck at 20 yards, but the brush was too thick. Another time it was 30 yards, and the buck was quartering towards me in alert. And it just shots I refused to take. And a lot of guys would be slinging arrows. And I just think that my biggest complaint with the hunting industry in my lifetime is that we went from having those good role models, true conservationists, to basically a bunch of killmongers, egomaniacs that are beating their chest because they did something. Half the time they did it unethically. Mm-hmm. And we've made heroes out of them, and it's pretty disgusting, really. Yeah,
no, I agree. I mean, I'm fortunate, I guess. I grew up, this is kind of maybe odd sounding, just, being a person who grew up in Pennsylvania with the hunting heritage that this state has, and, hunting from the time that I can remember and being outside since the time I can remember. But I don't ever recall watching outdoor television ever until I was older. When I was growing up, you didn't have TV where I grew up for a lot of my life. Growing up with my dad, we had rabbit ears, and that was about it, because there wasn't a whole lot of TV in that neck of the woods. But I grew up with hunting with my dad, and that was the one thing that I feel fortunate for, is because my dad, not everyone is this lucky, but that was always his approach to hunting. Was, it wasn't about what you were going to put in the back of your truck. It was about truly the experience. I was just telling a story to my buddy yesterday as we were driving, because we would go to hunting camp with my uncle or my two uncles, when I was a kid, and they would sometimes ride my dad because they would say he has the same box of shells he's had for 25 years because he refuses to pull the trigger. You know what I mean? Which was the kind of running joke. And I didn't really understand it until I got older. And what it was that he didn't care if he killed anything. That wasn't his reward. And I never got it until I got older, and it really dawned on me because I passed some deer here and there and stuff like that. And I was in Ohio hunting this year, and I had the first morning that I hunted on that rut trip, I had a shooter walk under my stand, but there was a different one that I had a camera picture of that I knew that was the guy I wanted to hunt. And he walked 5 yards underneath me, and he turned broadside at about 12 yards, and I drew back on him because I didn't know which deer he was because it was just at the break of light. And once I figured out he wasn't the one I was, looking for, I let him get out in front of me a little ways till he turned his head back or, away from me, and I drew down. And I texted my dad and said, just passed a shooter at 12 yards, and my dad said, he said, good job. He's like, it's all about the experience. And that was all he said to me. Yep. And that was it. And that was when it kind of dawned on me that, I think he probably felt like he did his job in that moment. You know what I mean?
Right. And I should probably back up a little bit because I'm not saying that everybody in the hunting industry today is a killmonger and unethical or anything like that. But what I'm saying is, who is today's Fred Bear? If you had to pick one person in the entire hunting industry that preaches ethics, who is it today?
Right. The only
that doesn't mean that they're doing things wrong or they're doing things illegal. It's just that we don't have, that ethical, I don't know what you call it, spokesperson for the industry. It's just like, it seems like it's a big void that's not there today, and it was when I was younger.
Yeah, I think, my opinion, John, I'd be curious to see, if you have a different opinion. I feel like we have guys in different areas that could be those guys, but the media and the coverage might not be the right word, but the media of the outdoor industry now is so fragmented that no one becomes that beacon. Right. So whenever Fred Bear was kind of that beacon, just using Fred Bear as an example, he, of course, Fred Bear Archery, right? He was Fred Bear, everything that came along with it. And it was really easy to identify and say, that's the guy, right? Because you may not hear a bunch from 30, 40 other people. There might've been 3 or 4 other stalwarts, giants of the industry, and they all kind of had, you could maybe say Will Primos too, right? There's a couple of those names, right? And now today, it's like when I think of conservation, it's like I think of a guy like Shane Mahoney, where it's like if you're not really into conservation and just a normal, average, everyday hunter, you probably don't know who Shane Mahoney is. You know what I mean?
Right.
Steve Ranella is another great example. But you have how many other media platforms and companies who are pumping out messages aside from Steve Ranella that he has to compete with to have that honest voice of conservation, right? And so I totally get what you're saying. I think there's a lack of it, but then I also think that those that we do have just have to fight so hard to have their voice heard that they're often drowned out. John, I'm not sure, what your thoughts are on that.
No, I think you make a valid point. I mean, whether it's social media, television, there's so many different sources, and there's so many more people that are in the limelight, so to speak, and it may be a little light, it may be a big, it may be a big spotlight or a moon, a lighthouse or something. But there's so many different people in there that I think the Fred Bears of the world kind of get drowned out quite a bit. So I think that can be. I go back and forth. What I do for a living is marketing, right? So. I'm always, I make a living for, promoting products. I like to think that I'm promoting good products, but I'm promoting products, to hunters. And so I might be part of the problem, I'm taking up space on social media and television and things like that, promoting these products or the product of sport, and it's drowning out the light of the Fred Bears of the world. But Don makes a seriously valid point, is who is the Fred Bear in today's day and age. I think the closest thing we have to it is maybe some of the people doing the public land awareness. that's probably the closest thing that's getting the media recognition that it deserves. And we all know a couple of guys that are in our wheelhouse, or, they're in our contact list in our phone, that these are just genuinely good dudes that really have a passion for the sport and for whitetails and for the outdoors as a whole. And, they donate their time and they're teaching the youth and getting the youth involved, but nobody knows their name. And it's kind of a shame.
Yeah, and I'm probably as guilty as anyone. There's a lot of guys just like me that they love the outdoors and they're trying to make a living at it. So, as we try to make a living, we're doing things, we're promoting products. But I think we can do those things while also promoting ethics.
Sure.
Sometimes we probably all fail at it. I mean, I'm far from perfect. I hope it didn't. I hope my little rant didn't come off like me thinking that I'm better than the next guy, because there's plenty of good people in the hunting industry. That was not my point at all. But we a true conservationist, someone that cares more about the game we pursue than killing it. Those guys are just lacking, and I think. Our youth really need some role models like that. So there might be an opportunity there. If someone's listening and they want to get into the hunting industry, why not be that guy that's the role model and that stands up for conservation instead of the guy that's running around the country trying to shoot giant bucks and look at me. There may be a place for someone like that in the hunting industry.
Well, and I mentioned this not, and I'll preface it. I'm legitimately not trying to toot my own horn. When I moved to Iowa, one of the first things I did was reach out to the local DNR, and I wanted to become a hunter safety instructor. And when I called, they were like, "Oh my gosh, are you serious? Like, we need new blood." We've got some older guys that have been doing it a long time. And one of their comments was, "Hey, you're involved in the outdoor industry. The kids might relate to you because they might have seen your products, or they might have seen your hunt somewhere or something like that, on social media or Facebook or whatever." So I volunteered to do that. But my purpose, and as much as I don't want to even talk about doing it, because I didn't do it to get a pat on the back, but for sake of this conversation, I'm bringing it up. Anybody listening, Don makes a good point, and it was one of the things I wanted to do was participate in those hunter safety classes to try to get our youth involved. And one of the things that I always talk about outside of safety is I always mention the part that we kind of touched on as far as promote yourself and what you're doing. Don't give the antis any ammunition. Show ethics, show respect for the animal. I always make a comment about, I don't ever want to see any more dead deer in the back of pickup trucks with a bunch of crushed up beer cans in the background.
Yeah.
If you're going to do a grip and grin hero photo, show some respect to the animal and try to take the best photo you can.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, Don, to your point, I'd say, I don't think, definitely not taking it as, you considering that we're, the three of us or any one of us is any better than anybody else. As you mentioned, it's like we're all far from perfect. I think it's just the ability to recognize that, and that just knowing that whenever you have an audience, or you're in a position of influence, whatever scale of influence that might be, there's a responsibility that comes with it, and it's always kind of think of it, in the sense of, whatever I'm doing, would I go tell my grandma or my dad? You know what I mean? It's like, if I did something in the hunting woods or whatever, it's like, would I go tell my dad, and would he give me an attaboy? And if he wouldn't, then it's probably not something I would do,
Right.
And so I don't think, John, to your point, it's not like we're not suggesting everyone needs to go run out and volunteer 40 hours a week to their, closest, outdoor nonprofit. But it's like, just do what you can, and some people can do more than others, and that's great. And if you can't, then just whenever you talk about it and people ask you to have a discussion about it, you just represent it the best way you possibly can. And that's all we can ask,
Exactly.
And that's, but so I digress. I do appreciate that part of the conversation, Don, because I knew I could get some, really what I like to call straight talk out of you, which was awesome, because it really kind of got me thinking. But I do want to change it back to some deer hunting tactics here. I guess in the spirit of, hunting stewardship and so forth. Talk about some hunting tactics and see if we can help some folks out with some late rut information. But I was reading your blog, I guess it was like 2 weeks ago. I was on there cruising around, and I know that there was a spot in October that you had located, that you had mentioned, and I think what the words you used was it just had that big buck feel. And I think you even mentioned in that article that it wasn't like you could put your finger on anything particularly about it where you were like, oh, it's because it's on the edge. There's a defined edge there that's, between or it's a transition area with cover, a transition cover, right? Or something like that. It wasn't anything that obvious. So I guess what I want to ask is, what is it about certain spots that don't have, what you would consider quote unquote to be like the perfect place, right? To be a big buck place, but you just kind of get that sixth sense that tells you found a place that is likely holding a mature buck. What is the one thing about those areas that you've kind of found that are consistent? Is there it's way away from pressure? Is it overlooked? Does it have a certain terrain feature? Is there anything that in your mind, you can kind of say, this is kind of what I see and what I'll kind of look for in those scenarios?
Well, it's almost like, and I know exactly what blog you're talking about, and I think I described it almost as a sixth sense. Whenever you stumble upon one of them spots, it's like you just get excited. I mean, I hung that stand, and it wasn't even November yet, but I guess I was so excited I wanted to stay in the stand and just stay there until November, because I knew there was going to be a big buck in front of that stand. And I think there's a lot of factors. Experience plays a big role in it, just knowing where you've seen big bucks in the past. And I always tried to replicate whenever I had a big buck encounter, I tried to replicate that in other locations. But a couple of things. One is a spot that's overlooked. But then, there's a lot of those little spots that are overlooked that don't have big bucks in them, but the type of cover, I really like old growed up cattle pastures where there hasn't been cattle for a few years, but it's growed up in weeds and briars and saplings, but on the ground, there's still some grass. It's not down to bare dirt yet. There's still some of that grass that the cattle used to graze on is down there, because the deer just absolutely love them. And if you can find a spot like that that's overlooked and nobody is putting any pressure whatsoever on, and access to it, if you know how the deer are limited on how they can come and go, they're not just coming from 20 different directions and leaving in 20 different directions. If their entrance and exit from that spot is limited, that just makes it all the better. And this spot had all those things. And believe it or not, I hung that stand and I never did go back and hunt it. But I had a trail camera real close there too, and I got a picture of some really nice bucks. A couple that would probably have been over 150, but I'm looking for giants. And I think one of the keys to killing giants is you don't burn out your areas until that giant's there. In other words, you don't go in there and educate every deer that's on the property to where your stands are. And then when the giant shows up, well, your odds of killing him, you've already run them years before he was there, because you told all the deer on the property, you stay away from that tree. So what I like to do on a spot like that is get my stand ready. And I'll have a camera in there again next year and the year after and the year after. And the year that the giant shows up, I'm ready to go. I mean, that stand's there, and there's I'm not running in there and hanging a stand and banging around and trimming and shooting lanes and this and that. I'll be ready to go. There will be a big deer in there again next year. Now, whether he's big enough that I want to shoot him or not, I don't know. But, those are some of the factors. I grew up an old cattle pasture that's been abandoned for a few years, and it's growing up with weeds and saplings and briars. It gets absolutely no better than that. And in fact, if I was looking to buy property today, everybody wants to head for the big woods, and those wooded properties, they bring a premium because that's what a deer hunter thinks is the best cover in the world. But if I was looking to buy a property and I wanted to get one at a bargain price, I'd look for an old abandoned cow farm that hadn't had cattle on it for a few years. And I'm telling you what, it wouldn't take long. You'd be shooting some giants.
Well, then I think I know what the type of properties I need to be looking for then, because actually it's funny.
Yeah.
My dad's property actually it's got a bunch of page wire fence all around. It's all dilapidated and kind of broke down because at one point that parcel was part of a larger farm, and that there's an area in there that kind of sits in the middle of the timber that is, it's exactly what you're saying. It was old pasture ground. You know what I mean? And the bucks will just bed in that stuff because it's still, we don't mow it or anything. We don't manicure it or anything like that. We just kind of let it get gnarly because it's tall enough that deer just kind of lay down and disappear in it. You know what I mean? So, and I've definitely seen deer just bedded in there. He snuck up on a buck. Actually, one of the nicer deer we had on the property. And this, not to go back on the ethics rant again, but the old man snuck up on it and had it, there dead to rights. He and I kind of talked about what we wanted to take off the property, and he couldn't get a good look at it. It gave him a good look. And once he recognized it wasn't the right one, and he let it go. You know what I mean? But it was just bedded out kind of two things you mentioned. It was bedded out in the middle of, out in the middle of creation. There was nothing really around it other than that tall grass, other than that pasture grass, but that was it.
Yep.
So I might have to be paying a little bit more attention, less attention to the timber, and maybe a little bit more attention to that grass. That seems like. But, you just mentioned, that of course you're known for, killing big deer, giants in fact, especially, last year. I'm just curious, what you think, what is, I guess, the one thing that light bulb moment for you as a deer hunter where it just kind of clicked and you went from killing good deer to killing great deer that kind of allowed you to kind of turn into the type of hunter you are today?
Well, it happened one season years ago. Back in the late 80s. ATVs, four-wheel ATVs had just come out, and I bought one summer, and that fall, I was covering some ground. And at that time, I was trapping and hunting other things too, but I was covering a lot of ground. And back then, you didn't have the issues that you would today. I had permission to, where I was hunting and things, but you could really cover a lot more ground in less time. And what I noticed that fall that I had that first fall I had that ATV was that the bigger bucks I was seeing, they were not in the wooded areas. They were out like on fence rows in the middle of nowhere, a little foxtail patch out in the middle of a section with maybe a single tree around it or something. Those bucks weren't staying where I thought they were. And I realized that if I wanted to kill them bucks, I was going to have to hunt in different locations than what I had been. And the reason those bucks were there, they were out there to get away from the hunting pressure. And it became so obvious to me that I needed to avoid other hunters as much as those bucks were avoiding other hunters. So if I was hunting a property where I knew there was another hunter, well, I just started assuming that other hunter has chased off any mature bucks. I got to go elsewhere. And so instead of hunting bigger properties, a lot of the places I started hunting were smaller pieces of cover. But that light bulb moment, so to speak, was when I realized that I couldn't hunt the same places where I'd been if I expected to kill big deer. I had to do the same thing they were doing, and I had to get away from the hunting pressure, even if it meant going out and sitting in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
And to kind of build on that, the trump buck I shot last year was a perfect example. He was on a little fence row. I mean, literally the only cover in the entire section was this little fence row. And in fact, the two guys that I shot him in the evening, went back to recovery the next morning, and I took a couple guys with me. Kevin Boyer, a friend of mine, was partner in Real World for 10 years. And then Ron Slifer, who has a bloodhound service, for tracking wounded deer. So I take these guys the next morning, and then we drive across. Ron's following me in his truck, and we get out to where we're going to start tracking. And these guys look at me like, why in the world were you hunting out here? In fact, they couldn't even believe anybody in their right mind would even think to deer hunt such a place. But that's where I'd learned over the years that those giant bucks go. They wherever the hunters are, that's not where the big bucks are. I mean, occasionally they'll be there chasing does or whatever, but for the most part, those deer are going to be someplace totally different. And that light bulb moment was that one fall, the first fall that I had that ATV, and I was trapping coyotes and such, and covering a lot of ground doing it, and I was going to and covering some places and getting back into out of the way places where I'd never been before or hadn't spent much time, and I just realized that I needed to go look elsewhere if I wanted to kill the giants.
Right, and as they say, the rest is history, right?
Well, I know I'm still learning. I certainly don't know it all, but one of my goals each season is to end the season a better hunter than when I started. So you just keep plugging away and putting together pieces of the puzzle like that.
Right. Well, on that note, trying to be a better hunter every year, and learn something new. The one thing that I've picked up from you, and I was just curious to pick your brain about it a little bit. And this is the first year I tried it. I didn't have a ton of success, but I also didn't have a whole lot of time to dedicate to it. But I've heard you talk about in the past that you really like that late rut time period, for an opportunity to kill a mature buck. And when I say late rut time period, I'm talking around that Thanksgiving kind of time frame. So what is it? What is it around that time that really kind of appeals to you?
Well, and this year was not a typical rut in the Midwest, especially because our temperatures got cold in October and they stayed cold. Typically you'll have a cold front come through and it'll be cool for 3 or 4 days and then it warms right back up. Well, it didn't happen that way this year. It got cool in the middle of October and it stayed cold, and those deer started rutting, or the bucks started rutting, and the does didn't come in heat any earlier than they always do, but I see more rut sign in October than I've ever seen in my life in October, and I've been in the deer woods over 40 years. That there's never been the scrapes and the rubs that I've seen this October. And what happened this year was those bucks started, running early. The does didn't come in heat any earlier, but by the time Thanksgiving rolled around, them bucks were wore out, I believe, and we didn't have the late rut activity that we have in past years. But typically, what happens is, the bucks are as November or October gives way to November, and the rut starts getting close. The bucks are getting more anxious each day. We'll get a cold front and they'll run hard, but that'll only last for 2 or 3 days, and then it warms back up and they settle down a little bit. But by the time November or Thanksgiving rolls around, the hot does are getting harder to find. And earlier in the month, a mature buck, he could just go basically from one hot doe to the next, and there was very little downtime between hot does. But you start getting towards the end of November, and there's more downtime between does. He's got to look harder and go farther between hot does, and that's when he's really vulnerable. He's not near as vulnerable with a doe as he is when he's looking.
Right.
So, that Thanksgiving weekend, there was a period, it's probably been close to 20 years ago now, but there was a period of 5 consecutive years where the biggest buck I seen from a stand each of those years was during Thanksgiving weekend. And it, I mentioned Roger Rothar earlier. Back when I was probably 20 years old or so, Roger preached how good Thanksgiving weekend was, and I always remember that. That's one of the lessons I picked up from him, and I paid attention over the years. And sure enough, Thanksgiving weekend, there's generally a lot of big bucks on their feet, and it's because they're between hot does and they're having to cover a lot of ground looking.
Mm-hmm. So, I know you were saying this year was a little bit different, because of the, how it got cold early and it just never seemed to snap out of it like it typically does. So, typically, if you had a normal kind of late Thanksgiving time frame type of scenario, how would you hunt that this time period specifically any different than you would early November? Or are you still kind of
not really?
No? Okay. So you're not
No, I would still hunt.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I would hunt the downwind edges of doe bedding areas,
mm-hmm.
hunt terrain features, and especially if you can combine the two, terrain features on the downwind edge of doe bedding areas.
Mm-hmm. Is there any terrain feature specifically that you really like that you kind of gravitate toward?
Well, pinch points, inside corners, or bends in a creek where it pushes all the deer activity, around the bluff or something like that.
Right. Have you ever seen? Because I've experienced this in this spot in Ohio that I hunt. I'm just curious if you've ever kind of witnessed this as well. But so what I've kind of started figuring out on this particular ridge is it typically comes in every year. It seems like that I've hunted there within the same kind of two-ish day window, 3-ish day window, roughly. And what I started piecing together, and this is I picked up from a fellow named Bronson Strickland. He's a deer biologist out at Mississippi State University, I believe is where it's at. And we were talking one day on the podcast, and he had mentioned I'd never known this. You may have known this because you had a herd of deer and stuff, but I didn't realize that doe fawns are past their mother's genetic breeding date genetically. So if the mother doe comes in on, just call it November 6th, that doe fawn will come in November 6th around the same time, right? Or
mm-hmm.
annually as well, give or take a day or so on each side of it. And what we know about
mm-hmm.
doe families is they stick together typically, right? The bucks disperse, right? So they don't have inbreeding, and doe families kind of huddle in the same area historically. And so what I started picking up, and I'm just curious if you started to see this stuff too, is that I noticed that certain areas that I've seen does getting chased, or during the rut where I know that a doe's hot, and if I pay attention to that, right, even if that doe is killed, that area usually comes in about the same time, because that entire doe family should have probably a very similar breeding cycle, right? Because they're all probably related to a degree, within reason.
Yep.
And so then what I
mm-hmm.
started doing was just kind of paying attention to where I've seen that in different properties, and kind of start to try to time my hunts on different properties based on when I've seen that rutting activity, because I know that those does should be coming back in about those same times. Do you follow something similar to that, or have you seen the same type of thing? Or I'm just curious what your experiences were.
Well, I definitely can relate to what he says about the does coming in heat. Whenever I had the captive herd, there was individual does that you could just mark on the calendar what day they were going to be in heat year after year. As far as with the wild deer, I never put it together like that. That's actually the first that I've heard that, and it makes total sense to me. But one thing I have noticed is, like I mentioned earlier, I've got about 50 trail cameras out in the woods. And I can just about tell you that when these bucks, like individual bucks, will shift their range in the fall, about half of them will. They will do it on almost the exact day. If I get a buck's picture at a certain location on a certain date, and that's a buck that I'm going to be targeting in the future, I know where to look for him and what day to look for him to be there. And, a lot of times when I find a shooter buck, I go back to my database of photos looking for that buck in previous years and where he was at on particular dates in previous years. Because you can pretty much mark it on your calendar that if he was at a certain spot on November 8th last year, next year, November 8th, if he's still alive, he's pretty much going to be there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I've experienced that once, where I was able to find a deer that was going to, react on a historical pattern. Do you find that holds more true the older they get? Because just, I'm sure you know this, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but Pennsylvania being as heavily hunted as it is, you don't get a lot of deer that get to maturity, so a 3-year-old deer in Pennsylvania is, if you have a nice 3-year-old on your property, and you get a shot opportunity and it's, within the goal of what you're looking for, you should probably take that shot opportunity because it's not a super common, age class of deer. But I'm just curious, do you see that even in younger deer, or is there a period in their life cycle where it's like they start to follow those kind of habitual historical patterns?
Well, to be honest, I'm hunting for deer that are. I'm trying to let them get to 6 years old,
right?
And it'd take a really special 5-year-old for me to shoot him, depending on the property he's on. So I'm really not focusing on an individual deer until he's 3 years old. And the reason for it is too many of them get killed if you start watching them when they're 2 years old. And then I have, found some good 2-year-olds that I tried to keep an eye on. But when I really start paying attention to a buck is when he's survived the gun season of the year he's 3.5. If he makes it through gun season when he's 3.5, the odds of him making it to maturity have really skyrocketed.
Okay.
Because he's really at 3.5. There's not very many very many hunters that are ever going to let him go, especially here in the Midwest. A 3.5-year-old buck here in the Midwest is pretty impressive animal, and most deer hunters are not going to let him walk. So, for me to relate to your situation is kind of tough because
right.
I'm not even watching them when they're that young.
Right. Yeah. See, we're here in PA. It's like you get a 2-year-old that has that has promise. It's like you start watching him.
Yeah.
And it's like you're hoping.
I wait a year later.
Yeah, you're hoping he makes it one more year. You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
But Don, I want to be sensitive to your time. Not only that, but I've learned so much from you from listening to podcasts and reading stuff that you've written. The fact that I was able to actually share something that was new information to you means that I've achieved something. So I'm going to stop there and just ask John if he has any more questions before we let you go.
Every time I walk near, if you just get within 10 feet of Don Higgins, just through osmosis, you become a better deer hunter.
Well, I don't know about that. You're liable to hear an opinion you don't want to hear if you get.
Well, I guess the good thing for me, a lot of our opinions are very similar.
Yeah, well, I try as I get older to be a little more respectful of other people's opinions, and I think I have to some degree, but there's some things that are just black and white. You're either right or you're wrong.
There you
That's
go.
right.
That's right. Well, hey, before we do let you go, I wanted to just give you an opportunity to let folks out there know where they can find out more about you, where they can find your products, and anything that anything that you're working on.
Well, they can visit my personal website, which is higginsoutdoors.com. Also, if they're interested in the seed products or the deer nutrition products, if they go to realworldwildlifeproducts.com, they can find more information there. And, you can go on my Facebook page. I've got 2 of them. I got, my personal page, but I've also got a business page, Higgins Outdoors /Don Higgins. And I try to answer every email, every message that's sent to me, every phone call I try to return, and I don't want to be. God didn't make me any better than He did anybody else. I try to stay humble and down to earth. So, I just try to respond to anybody that takes the time out of their day to write me a message. I think I owe it to them to respond. So, just feel free to comment if you disagree with me. That's fine. We can argue on email just as well as we can on the phone or in person. And that doesn't mean that I don't respect your opinion. I just want you to hear mine as well. So, I hope to hear from some people and see the shows this winter. I'm going to be speaking at the Iowa Deer Classic, and there's a show on the Indiana-Michigan line, the Michiana Outdoor Show. I'll be speaking there. I'll be at the ATA show. Real World Wildlife Products will have a booth at the ATA show. Stop in, say hello. I'd love to meet you. And, I just hope everyone has a a great Christmas and a successful hunting season. Look forward to meeting more deer hunters.
Awesome. Well, I do appreciate you coming on. Appreciate your presence in the outdoor industry too. You're one of a kind, and I'm glad you're on our side. And I might have to hit you up for a little soybean planting tutorial here when we get closer to spring, and then I'll be out at ATA with John. So I'll try to catch up with you when I'm out there as well.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Maybe we can sit down and have lunch or go out for supper after the show one evening.
I'd love it, man. Let's make that happen. Now, I will say I am at your disposal whenever you're ready to go grab some grub.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me on, guys.
All right, folks, that is a wrap for today's show. We'd like to, of course, thank Don for joining us. Be sure to check him out at two places. First, his realworldwildlifeproducts.com website. Check that out. That's where he has all the different seed, mineral, supplement, etc. that he has going on in the deer nutrition kind of space. Also, check him out at higginsoutdoors.com. Here's where you'll find his blog, information on how to get in contact with him if you're looking for someone to come out and do any type of land or habitat consultations as well. I'll place all those links, of course, in the blog post show notes so you guys can easily find them. We'd, of course, like to thank all of you for listening, and if you haven't yet, please head over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star rating, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast. We'd be super pumped if you would do those two things for us. And before we shut this jammer down, we need to give a big shout out to our partners that continue to help us make this podcast possible. Wicked Tree Gear, Exodus Outdoor Gear, Trophy Ridge, Ozonics, Obsession Bows, Tecumseh Seed, Glacier Coolers, Ramcat Broadheads, Trophy Taker Rests, and Dead Downwind. And until next time, we'll see y'all.